Thank you so much. Just a couple of brief preparatory words. First, thanks to the Academy, Martin Hagemann. We worked together many years ago. I lost him a lot of money, but it's great to reconnect under very bright circumstances, and I'm not losing him any money tonight. I should also say you're very lucky. I only got to 23 fragments and then gave up. So as you'll be counting your blessings shortly. And I just want to say one last thing before I begin the talk, and that is, at the end of the talk, we'll have time for discussion, during which time you really can ask any question whatsoever on this topic or any other. And I say that because there's a very high probability, given my orneriness and my kind of contrary nature, that what you're about to hear will make absolutely no sense to you whatsoever, and we'll just ignore it for the rest of the evening. So just feel free to ignore it when it's all over. And I think that's it for introductory remarks. I think we can dive right in. 1. Let us begin with a quotation from the late, great Theodor Adorno. Whoever speaks of culture speaks of administration, whether this is his intention or not. 2, you've invited me here tonight to speak on the topic of the future of cinema. Right? I didn't make this topic up, you did. This is not an easy task, given all the challenges buffeting our industry and our art form. Challenges such as the declining theater attendance in markets like the United States, piracy, increased competition for attention from games and sports and online social media and web and television series, changing structures of finance and revenue flows that come with the reconfiguration of ancillary markets following the fall of DVD sales and the rise of video on demand and subscription streaming services such as Netflix, the impact of increased consolidation among the large corporations that own the various integrated media empires, political and economic constraints on sales and pre-sales of independent and studio films across borders and regions, and the presumed rise of the blockbuster mentality among the studios. Now, that makes this a very difficult task. My task is made easier, however, by the fact that I really don't care about the future of cinema, or if I can put it more philosophically, I just don't give a shit. I do care, however, about why you care, why you're worried about the future of the cinema, and I care and have concern for you, my friends and colleagues here in Berlin. Number 3, the cinema, said Louis Lumière in 1895, is, quote, an invention without a future. 4, of course, everyone thinks Lumière was obviously and ironically completely mistaken. Even if we are worried that cinema today may not have a future, we believe that cinema at one point did have a future. It's just that cinema's future is now more likely in its past. But I think we should take Lumière seriously. What if, from its very inception, the cinema was and still is precisely a way of organizing masses of human beings into processes of imagining, producing, and exchanging stories and images that at one and the same time solicits our sense of futurity while closing down our hopes that we might be agents ourselves of that future. The cinema makes us modern, and it does so by announcing to us that the future is already here. So naturally, what usually follows this future that is already here is nothing short of the apocalypse. An apocalypse we can only imagine resolving itself in our favor through some kind of heroic return to a recognizable, if reconfigured, Edenic, long-gone past. Cinema implants the technologies of our ultimate destruction into the very means by which we create our dreams and fantasies. How else can we account for the fact that no one seems to notice that Méliès's Voyage to the Moon stages a massive and apocalyptic race war as its denouement, or that Interstellar and its thousands of antecedents locate the future as the simultaneous destruction and reproduction of the social relations that defined our fantasies of our quaint and rural past. Cinema congeals around its individual heroes and heroines precisely this obvious refusal of the idea of a collective, co-created future. Sergei Eisenstein had this figured out in the 1920s when he brilliantly linked D.W. Griffith and the rise of Hollywood global cinema to its contradictory embrace of both a frenetic modernity and an old-fashioned Dickensian parochialism. He was amazed by the paradox of his experience of visiting New York City. Sky-high buildings, exuberant capitalism, modern automobiles, but all of them stuck in traffic, moving at a snail's pace, and the apartments in those high-rises filled with false Victorian furniture, stained wood cabinets covered with doilies, and people with very small-town values. So when we worry about the future of cinema, we worry about the future of something that produces at the very core of its being a no-future future. We worry about the future of this thing with no future, which constantly solicits us to imagine, finance, create, and exhibit to each other this no future, this walking death of our imagined interstellar past. Is this what you were worried about losing when you worry about the future of cinema? 5. Another way to think about this. The best way to ensure that there is no future for cinema is to structure your thinking about cinema around the problem of its future, as if this were even a problem. One reason the future of cinema is not a problem is because the cinema is already dead anyway, and you already know that. Think of it this way. 40 years ago, if we were to gather together under similar circumstances, you would more than likely have asked me to come to Berlin and talk about, quote, the cinema today, or something like that, right? Remember back in the day, people would say, the cinema today, right? Today, no one among us thinks the cinema today, because we're too busy thinking about the cinema's future, about trends and threats. And the reason we're worried about the future of cinema is because we know the cinema is already dead, and we'd rather not think about that fact. Of course, by this, I don't mean that there's still not a lot of movies and great movies, and there's, of course, a lot of great movie makers. I only mean simply that the cinema is dead. Now, being dead, it turns out, is not the same thing as not existing. Many things exist that are dead. Indeed, I'd argue that many of the greatest things that exist are dead, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. And the fact that something is dead doesn't mean that it doesn't have some kind of future. The cinema, from its inception, repeatedly gives us this lesson. The dead are also always in the movies the undead. Not exactly alive, but they're always coming back, they're returning, popping up from the grave, blah, blah, blah. And the living, caught on film, are always soon to be dead, even as their shadows continue to animate the screens in front of us. To be captured on film is, in a very important way, to partake in the announcement of your own death, to participate, however passively, in your protest against this fact. Right? You're going to be dead, sorry. Siegfried Kracauer, following Proust, understood this beautifully well. The camera as a death machine that inscribes, through its very alienation and objectification of our vision, the possibility of experiencing the overlooked and the left for dead world around us, the world we couldn't pay attention to without this mechanical abjection that captures and then represents our world to us. For Kracauer, the photographic essence of the cinema was the means by which cinema could escape the death grip of traditional art, which closed off the world from us through its formal structures. And for Kracauer, the supreme example of this was tragedy. True cinema, Kracauer argued, even if it tried for tragic closure, always had within it this escape valve. It captured the trivial, the unnoticed, the unimportant, the seemingly meaningless. It scooped them all up, along with its heroes and heroines and their storybook fates and their three-act structures. Today, under the sign of the digital, we're told that this photographic, indexical function of the cinema is disappearing. And with it, the balance between what Krakauer called recording and formal functions that he celebrated as the essence of the cinema, the true value of the cinematic. Is this perhaps what you are worried about losing when you worry about the future of the cinema, all of this trivia and rubbish and abject refuse? 6. On November 5th, 2014, Christopher Nolan's Interstellar opened in North America on its release on 279 screens, on which his movie was projected via 35mm film as well as IMAX film. 2 days later, it expanded to thousands and thousands of digital screens. That is, this bold cinematic vision of the future was, at its, so to speak, inception, a gesture of tremendous nostalgia for film. But this is, as I just argued, always the future of the cinema. It always has been. We're always in the cinema traveling into an imagined future in order to inhabit our ideal past. We don't have a future. 7, thus, to imagine a future for cinema, we have to imagine the possibility of a cinema that might actually be able to think the future without figuring it as an undead version of our past. Thinking about this future, though, would be the opposite of worrying about the future of cinema. 8. Another cinematic way of thinking about our worry for the future of the cinema. Perhaps it is an issue of mutants and clones. In one version of its history, cinema crawled out of its primordial swamp, the decaying flesh of live theater, by installing its dead ghost images inside those very theatrical spaces where live humans used to strut around and exclaim. Right? Within 2 decades of its arrival, cinema had, like a mutant virus, killed off most of those live actors and taken over the body of the theatrical stage and turned it into a screen. And more, it did so by replicating itself, not so much by copying as by cloning. We say such and such a film, like E.T., but the film E.T. is actually an ideal conceptual construct that exists because each film print of E.T. claims its status not as the copy of some original E.T., but as the clone of the ideal E.T., an ideal we only extract from the existence of an inter-negative. That is, like Sartre's being, film only emerges as a phenomenologically available datum, sense datum, data of experience, through our actions of what Sartre would call nihilization, right? Néantisation, negating, in this case, a negative, internegative ideal. Right? Over the course of the past 120 years, the cinema has adapted to and co-mutated with a number of other technologies. Some of these have entered inside the body of the cinema, such as sound, and then digital recording. Some of these have formed infrastructures and pathways for audience and market construction into which the cinema has had to acclimate itself, such as television and the internet. The worry is that, of course, these new viral, as we call them, viral forms, going viral. We went viral, right? I mean, they were live tweeting this already, like we're going viral. These new viral forms are eating the cinema alive from its insides. That's our worry. And it's forcing cinema's migration to hostile environments where it can't adapt and compete with other forms that are more suited to these new conditions and whose mutations are more competitive, like YouTube videos. It is this, or I should ask, is it this we are worried about when we worry about the future of cinema? That is, have we taken our own mutating virus, the one that killed off all those theater actors, and turned it over time into an idea of a unified, singular, artistic, ideal form, now under assault from these new, even deadlier half-life forms? 9. The cinema has something to do with the experience of narratives unfolding in or around a couple of hours, more or less, play-acted in front of cameras, assembled into edited products that, at least initially, are projected onto screens in front of audiences who pay to enter and sit in dark spaces together facing those screens, like you guys right now. Of course, from an economic point of view, such an idea of cinema has not existed for many, many decades. Indeed, for coming up on probably half its actual lifespan, the cinema has not been the cinema, as the entire economic edifice which supports the idea of the cinema has rested on the sources of its actual profits, the sum total of the ancillary values derived from the windowing of video and DVD, cable and television licensing, pay TV, TV syndication, and now digital streaming. For most of my lifetime, a theatrical release has been simply, even in its most successful iteration, a loss leader, a form of advertising that gave legitimacy to the product's identity as cinema in its actual economic life downstream on smaller screens. The entire economy that this idea of cinema supports rests primarily on a business that involves selling sugar water and fat-laden carbohydrates at 90% profit margins to sedentary and lethargic groups of consumers who agree to sit still long enough for their blood sugar levels to go down sufficiently so that it can be sold, these sugar and fat products, in large enough quantities to justify the expense of operating cinema theaters and making and marketing so-called films. As I am wont to say, the most important 6 words in the film business are, and I quote, these are the words you should remember if you want to stay in movies, "No outside food or drink allowed." The future of cinema can thus be thought of first and foremost as the future of regularly congregating large numbers of people to ingest fat and sugar in front of screens. Is this the future of cinema that you are worried about? Here is another way to think the future of the cinema. Sorry. Cinema insists on the singularity, right? Hold on. Cinema insists on the singularity, even if it is a rewatchable singularity, of its audiovisual narrative experience. In this sense, we associate cinema with something you pay for by the specific unit of consumption. One ticket to Der Schuh des Manitou gives you 1 unit of Der Schuh des Manitou consumption. But already there's something off about this assumption. Even the way we say things like, let's go to the movies, that is, we always have thought the cinema as somehow already plural, not singular. This is perhaps a leftover of the days in which the cinema functioned as a kind of community television, consumed in double and triple features, accompanied by short newsreels and trailers. That is, we have only in retrospect made the cinema out to be the site of this singular experience, and we hold on to this idea by believing that cinema begins its path in one-off theatrical experiences from whence the unit of cinematic consumption begins its journey over time into its own future, that is, from a single unit of consumable leisure time into its emerging and merging into an eventual, steadily growing and near infinite pile of digital entertainment stuff that is available, as they say, anytime, anyhow, and anywhere on any and all platforms. So, the future of cinema always has within it this future of each individual unit of cinema. It begins as a proposal for a singular transaction in a theater, then a singular transaction available from a much more vast menu as a DVD or pay-per-view sale or rental, and then over time it joins an amorphous mass of programming and digital stuff floating in various clouds. 11. The current thinking has it, at least in the States, somewhat in the UK, Scandinavia, perhaps France, that television, broadly conceived as also including digital streaming, is creatively and financially where the action is. Is television's recent surge the cause for your anxiety about the future of cinema? But as we noted, cinema has been essentially a televisual endeavor for most of the past century anyhow. What specifically cinematic thing do you think is being threatened now? One way to answer this question is to think about how one sense of time, the journey from the now to the future, is thought to enact itself in movies and in television series. Is there a difference between how movies and TV series partake of this journey through time? Certainly, when the producers of a TV series begin their work, they sketch out in advance many of the story arcs and the destinies of their characters. But the entire point of launching a TV series is that you don't actually ever want it to end. The real money comes in extending the series for many, many seasons, during the course of which various contingencies can be adapted to. For example, audiences might fall in love with a secondary character who is then promoted in the next season to center stage, or an actor begins to behave badly and ask for too much money when it comes time to renegotiate his contract, so you just kill him off or remove him. The point is that the, quote, final episode is always an embarrassment, an existential embarrassment for a TV series. Either an abrupt pulling of the plug by the television network or an admission of creative or audience exhaustion, aging, etc. TV series, even if not especially beloved ones, always seem to end either too soon or too late. By contrast, a film, to be successful, must seek out and fulfill its end from the very start. Even if it is to be sequelized or prequelized, it is envisioned, or it's envisioned as a multi-part work such as the Harry Potter movies. That is, even if it engineers some kind of narrative or temporal gap or hole into its endings through which we can imagine or desire further adventures, a film proposes at its very inception one thing for sure: it has thought through its end. In this sense, the cinema indeed has no future, precisely because it must know its end before it begins, unlike television, right? You don't go into the movie, you don't go to the theater and go, I'm gonna go see this great movie. It could go on for fucking ever. Like, I have no, this movie, you know, and you know. 3 acts. Clearly, however, this kind of televisual temporality has always been part of the cinema, actually, from even before there was television. Les Mystères de Paris, B-movie and Western serials, etc. It's ingrained in some of cinema's most, well, cinematic successes, the Star Wars films, for example. And yet this sense of narrative destination, so linked to the self-identity of each individual film, is still cherished as an ideal essential to cinema's defenders, regardless of how fragile it is. So you are worried about the future of something that must incorporate already by its very nature its ending before it begins. 12. I began these fragments with a quotation from Theodor Adorno, to which I now return. Tonight we gather in Berlin as filmmakers, as producers of cinema, and perhaps we should confess that our worries about the future of cinema are worries about the future of us. 13. It's not so much that producers produce cinema as it is that cinema, as an ideology and institution, produces cinema producers. Of course, the cinema produces images and sounds that combine to tell stories. It produces emotions and ideas, too. But just as importantly, the cinema produces a cadre, a cohort of administrators whose function it is to transform money, intellectual property, and labor into a network of relations and activities and protocols embedded in audiovisual data, organized as stories, meant for circulation across a wide array of media. Co-production treaties, letters of credit, inter-party agreements, licensing agreements, escrow accounts, talent deals, and the technologies of marketing and publicity that create and help constitute audiences and target demographics. Cinema produces a specific set of various areas of expertise on top of or underneath all the kinds of expert craftsmanship involved in acting, lighting, scoring, writing, directing, etc. 14. This professional and administrative expertise is always described as having to locate itself on a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum is something we call art or culture. On the other end of the spectrum is something we call money or capital. It is assumed in the film world that too great a preoccupation with art equals probably too little return on capital, and that too much obsession with return on capital equals too little regard for art, and that the job of the producer is somehow to balance these competing and opposite ends of this presumed spectrum. The cinema, of course, makes a mockery of this assumption, and the idea that it is the producer's task to calibrate this so-called balance is one of the great institutional jokes of our profession. For art, this concept that emerged here in Germany most forcefully during the 18th century Enlightenment, and capital, another idea that emerged concomitantly with the modern idea of the concept of aesthetic here, are not opposites. They are rather functions of each other. The presence of art in a world in which all objects and relations are reducible to abstract, exchangeable units of value allows us to imagine human productive force as, at its most human, priceless, beyond exchange value. But funny enough, the priceless always, too, manages to command its price, and that which has its price always has it because it can serve as a depository for the production and exchange of our human dreams and our desires and our fantasies. We believe that these fantasies exceed or are additions to our basic needs and the assignment of use values to the objects we manufacture and exchange to meet those needs. But of course, it's the fantasies themselves that are the ground for this entire lunatic economic system. And so, perhaps, your worries about the future of cinema are worries about whether or not the fantasy structures produced and administered by you, the professional cadre enlisted to sustain the system of fantasy value exchange, are strong enough and resilient enough today for a system that is increasingly hyper-financialized and abstract. Are the desires we produce capable of keeping our audiences tethered, tied to this system? Or are the current shifts in the flow of money in and out of narrative sound image chains, how the money gets into the chain of stuff we call stories and movies, are those shifts dispersing our desires and fantasies away from identifiably cinematic narrative units and structures and into more scattered and ephemeral units that we don't control anymore? 15. Money is itself a technology of the future. Its only value is its embodiment as a token of our fantasy or belief that at some future date it will still be redeemable. Right? That's why in America the dollar bill has things like "In God We Trust" on it, because it's a piece of paper. Whatever. The cinema, and in this sense cinema stands in for a certain version of art, disrupts this idea of a future promise even as it shares essentially the same form as money. For cinema, as I have argued here, posits its end at its beginning, imagines the future as a kind of past, insists on an identity that claims that each film in particular is unique. Dollar bills cannot, by their very nature, be thought of as unique. It's like, oh, I have a better dollar than you. Like, yours is dirty, so mine's worth more. No, it's all the same. At least before the film's inevitable disappearance into the pile of digital content that it joins on the far horizon of its value chain at the end of all these windows it passes through. 16. To the extent, then, that cinema is art, it serves as a vanishing pool into which money flows and disappears into culture. Culture is thus the creation of a present that refuses the logic of money as the way to think the future. Even as I pointed out ahead, the contradiction is kind of just money. But, as Adorno has shown us, This is an ideological fantasy, a trap. The more culture pretends to be unadministratable as art, the more it legitimizes the very idea that the world of monetary equivalence, use value, and instrumental reason is the real world, when, as we learn again and again, that so-called real world is often a nightmare fantasy of exploitation, destruction, and unreality. 17. Here is what we are told day in and day out by all the current prognosticators of the future of cinema. What are we told? This. The consumer wants his entertainment when he wants it, where he wants it, and how he wants it. He wants it now. Those who are too old-fashioned to get with this program will soon be killed off by the innovators and disruptors who will service without hesitation this gigantic infant consumer. But there's another way to phrase this injunction, this rule. The providers of entertainment, the corporation states and state corporations, need to know what this gigantic baby consumer is doing, when he is doing it, and how he is doing it, and they need to know it now. 19. Value is created not in the exchange of time and attention for entertainment, but in the production, manipulation, and control of the consumer data generated when the subject, the person, lives within this world of immediate data points that they create by interacting with the system. In this world, all money and power flows through those with the algorithms. Our job as producers is simply to feed enough operationally viable fantasy points into the infrastructure so it can sustain itself as the source of fantasy and identity for its consumer subjects. That's our job. The reason for this shift has again to do with the incorporation of the future into this value chain. The algorithms produce mainly probabilities and predictions. The goal is to capture the consumer baby's attention and purchase decision-making as much as efficiently as possible. Okay? We've got to capture their decision-making, this big consumer baby, and we've got to do it efficiently, and we've got to hold on to it as long as possible. And this means refining the menu of options in front of the consumer baby based on the accumulating evidence of all of his or her prior fantasy money interactions within the system, as well as those of all similar consumer babies from whom actuarial data and predictions can be generated by analogy and social mapping. Okay. 20. The same logic that goes into the super government's surveillance of all our data so that it can predict and thus, in advance, right, in advance of time, preemptively quash the possibility of attack or subversion. This same logic also goes into our Netflix queue. In order to turn this to account, however, prediction must become, as simultaneously as possible, production. Prediction becomes production. It is much more efficient to predict what someone will choose when, on the one hand, your target believes she is an agent with free choice, and on the other hand, she has as few choices as possible to choose from. You can see how this works in our corporate-controlled elections in the United States, now essentially financed by competing factions of billionaires who pay for the mass production of fantasies of choice into which voters are invited and encouraged to participate. 21. With regards to the future of cinema, my point, such as I have one, is that everything now converges on the refinement of these technologies of the future and of consumer baby behavior prediction, while the definition of the future becomes increasingly shrunk down to a micro-order of milliseconds of decisions about what to click, view, sign, vote for, or purchase. Perhaps your worry about the future of the cinema has to do with your nostalgia for a kind of cinematic citizen, someone not tied into or tethered to this system, but rather someone who, private and anonymous in the great cinema-going crowd, sits and watches your work without becoming fodder for the production of this near simultaneous and predictable set of delimited futures. Now, whether or not this cinematic citizen has ever really existed or can exist today is probably besides the point. The idea of her locates at the very least a point of resistance for you to reflect on this current and unfolding reality that you're worried about. 22. We can think of this in terms of information theory. I see I'm just getting more and more fun. You know, information theory. This is the fun part. The second law of thermodynamics postulates that all matter is inexorably trending toward indifferentiation and eventual heat death. This is probable to the point of certainty. Information is the presence of improbable configurations of matter. That's what you do. You create improbabilities. Art, for example, or the narrative, it is thus meaningful to the extent that it reorganizes matter in such a way that it pushes back against this inevitable, certain, non-differentiated, unfolding state and creates improbable objects for us to encounter. It intervenes in this version of temporal progression toward eventual certain heat death, and thus introduces to us the experience of a different kind of time, a different kind of temporality, or at least a protest to the idea of time as the unfolding of indifferentiation and eventual heat death. In a sense, art points elsewhere, if not backwards, to a future that is not in front of us. And cinema, to the extent it has been something of our past century's premier art form, is an idea that allows us to think differently from, away from, and against that so-called future. Perhaps it is the value you place in this non-future that has you worried about the future of cinema. 23. So, you asking me to come here to Berlin, looking at you, to talk about the future of cinema was a simple but understandable mistake. Given that you've asked me for a kind of thinking that the cinema itself, to the extent there still is such a thing as the cinema, objects to. So now you know why I don't care about the future of cinema and why I think you should not care either. Lumiere, at the very beginning of the cinema, was absolutely right. It was an invention without a future. He was right then, and he's even more right tonight.